the whereby okay, I guess. If we have anything to prepare. We are live. Yeah. I promise you. It's not the founders. The fear of right. Give me 1 second.
Making sure the technology is working.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Global Taiwan Institute. My name is Russell Shao. I'm the executive director here at GTI. GTI is a 501c3 think tank dedicated exclusively to Taiwan policy research and related programs. Our mission is to enhance the relationship between the United States and Taiwan with the world by contributing to a more informed discussion about Taiwan and its people. In pursuit of that mission, we undertake several major programs. They include our bi-weekly Global Taiwan Brief, public seminars, an annual symposium in the fall, fellowship and scholarship opportunities, as well as a series of podcasts. If you're not already subscribed to receive our updates directly in your inbox, please visit our website at globaltaiwan.org. Now, before I begin today's program, I would like to thank our co-founders, our board of directors, our advisors, as well as all the staff and interns who make all our programs here possible. Let's begin. I'm really delighted to be able to feature today's panel discussion, China's new offensives against Taiwan. I think after a brief lull in the months following the Woodside Summit between President Biden and Xi, and immediately leading up to the Taiwan's 2024 elections, cross-strait tensions are once again steadily escalating. Taiwan now faces an increasingly multifaceted campaign of coercion from the People's Republic of China. This multi-domain offensive has clearly intensified following the election of Taiwanese President Lai Ching-te, potentially marking a significant shift in the PRC's strategy towards Taiwan. While the existential military threats posed by the People's Liberation Army to Taiwan and regional peace persist and arguably escalates day by day, as clearly reflected in the Joint Sword 2024 exercise, 3 days following Lai's inauguration speech, which Chinese officials stated were intended to, quote, serve as a strong punishment for the separatist acts of Taiwan independence, end quote. Beijing's aggressive maneuvers, however, extend beyond the military realm. They have intensified in the diplomatic, the informational, as well as the military, economic, and legal domains, heightening the complexity of the security situation in and around the Taiwan Strait. I cannot be more pleased with the experts that we have been able to assemble today to delve into these various dimensions of the PRC's multi-domain offensive against Taiwan. And in examining these elements of the coercive campaign, I hope that our panelists will attempt to shed some light on its far-reaching implications, both for Taiwan's democracy, regional security, as well as broader geopolitical issues. Today's discussion will also try to explore the potential responses and strategies that Taiwan and its allies can employ to navigate and counter these heightened threats, ensuring that a comprehensive understanding of the evolving cross-strait dynamics can be addressed to ensure regional and global peace and security. Allow me now to introduce the speakers briefly in the order in which they will be speaking. To my immediate left, we have Doshi, who is the CB Star Senior Fellow for Asia Studies, the director of the newly launched China Strategy Initiative over at the Council on Foreign Relations. Before joining CFR, Rush was the Deputy Senior Director for China and Taiwan, President Biden's National Security Council. And he's also the author of a landmark book on China's strategy called The Long Game, China's strategy to displace, a grand strategy to displace American order, which I look forward to talking about in today's discussion as well, which is highly relevant to our conversation. Next, joining us online is Alexander Gray. He is a senior non-resident fellow here at GTI, as well as a senior fellow in national security affairs at the American Foreign Policy Council. Alex also serves as the chief executive officer at American Global Strategy, a strategic advisory firm co-founded by Ambassador Robert O'Brien, the 27th National Security Advisor of the United States. And previously, he served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Chief of Staff of the White House National Security Council under the Trump administration. Now, returning back here in person to Rush's left is John Dotson. He is the director here at GTI, a former U.S. Navy officer, as well as a former professional staff member at the congressionally mandated U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. He held a number of different posts, as well as also as editor of China Brief at the Jamestown Foundation. Last but not least, we have Dan Blumenthal. He is a resident fellow and director of the Asian Studies for Asian Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Dan has served and advised the U.S. government on China issues for many decades. He served as a commissioner on the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, as well as vice chairman of that commission in a prior post. He is also the author of The China Nightmare, the grand ambition of a decaying state. We had the pleasure of also hosting Dan for a book talk on that excellent book when it was released back in 2020. So, as you can see, we have assembled a fantastic group of experts here. Just so that you have a sense of the run of show, we do want to hear from all of you. So after the speakers each provide their opening comments for roughly around 10 minutes, I'll engage in a moderated Q&A and we'll reserve around 15 minutes at the end of the session to take your questions, because we do want to hear from you as well. And for those of you joining us online, you may send your questions to contact@globaltaiwan.org, or you may use the chat function on the YouTube page, or even tweet us with our hashtag @GlobalTaiwan. So I'll issue another reminder as we get closer to that time. But without further ado, let me turn it over now to Rush Doshi to lead up our discussion. Rush, over to you.
Well, thanks very much. And it's great to be with all of you. Thanks to the Global Taiwan Institute for hosting this really important panel discussion. I think I've been asked to kind of speak a little bit about how, the PRC is looking at Taiwan and cross-strait, issues in particular in the aftermath of sort of political change in Taiwan and of course, President Lai Ching-te's arrival into office. So I'll offer a largely factual presentation. Look forward to back and forth and Q&A in the period thereafter. I think it's probably worth starting a bit before, rewind the clock a bit further back, the way that Russell just did a moment ago. And we can start with maybe looking at how things unfolded in August 2022. In August 2022 is when Speaker Nancy Pelosi, of course, went to Taiwan. the first House Speaker to do so in almost a quarter century. And then, of course, the PRC responded with military exercises that were in many ways unprecedented. We saw record numbers of ATIS incursions, center line crossings, elevated ship and Coast Guard presence around Taiwan. It was really unprecedented. Really an erosion of the norms that had really governed the Strait effectively. They were implicit norms, not less, that had governed the Strait for many decades. They eroded those norms. And then famously, they fired ballistic missiles over Taiwan, including into Japan's EEZ, which was problematic from the Japanese perspective as well. So they didn't do themselves any favors within the region. So it was a pretty consequential set of military operations. It went on for days, as many of us remember. Some people call that the fourth Taiwan Strait crisis. You can call it that if you want. Some disagree. Either way, it doesn't matter. The point is, it was the biggest kind of set of military provocations that had occurred, since the late 1990s. So that's where I think we can begin the recent story. As all of us know, those operations not only eroded the status quo, but they raised questions around the world about China's intentions vis-a-vis Taiwan. There were questions about whether or not China would continue to escalate militarily in the waters around Taiwan. There were questions about whether it was going to more boldly pursue military solutions to the Taiwan question, as they would put it. There were also questions about whether or not it was safe for multinational companies to be invested in China, given the risk of greater tension. I think people forget that one significant byproduct of those incidents was that multinationals around the world began to rethink their presence in the PRC because they were concerned that in light of these military tensions, maybe things were changing. And instability was not just unhelpful for Taiwan, not just unhelpful for the United States, but it was unhelpful for the PRC as well. Now, owing to all those factors, I think things didn't quite go the way that people would have expected in the year and a half after August 2022. I think if most of us have been asked, certainly if I've been asked in August 2022, are things in the Strait going to get significantly more tense? Say about the same or get less tense? I think almost everybody would have said significantly more tense. People expecting more tension. But that isn't exactly what happened. I think that's an interesting fact. And it's worth kind of thinking a little bit about. And there are many reasons for why that occurred. But one of the most important was I think the PRC recognized that its provocative action, at least at that moment in time, backfired a bit. And the world was quite concerned about what the PRC was doing. Lots of economic organizations began estimating the global cost of a military clash in the Taiwan Strait. China companies invested in China began to pull out. They were concerned. The U.S. took more actions, in the economic, technology, political, and military realm in direct response as well. So there was, to some degree, perhaps the PRC didn't get as much strategic advantage as it would have hoped. There's another element here as well, which is that Washington and Taipei coordinated a bit on the question of how to manage cross-strait issues. You saw a bit more careful management of future high-level visits. There was rumor and speculation that Speaker Kevin McCarthy was going to go to Taiwan for a variety of reasons. Instead of that happening, President Tsai went to the United States and met with Speaker McCarthy on U.S. soil, the first time that had ever happened. It was interesting. I mean, that particular moment, you could slice it in a number of ways. From the PRC perspective, you could argue, wow, okay, we were thinking the speaker was going to go to Taiwan. That didn't happen. This looks de-escalatory. Well, from Taiwan's perspective, you could say this is the first time a Taiwan president has ever met a House Speaker on U.S. soil. You could take it, a particular political act and divide it as either escalatory or non-escalatory, as part of precedent or a minor adjustment to precedent. You could kind of basically spin it any way you needed to spin it. And in that was a kind of elegant, artful management of cross-strait issues. But there's a face-saving off-ramp and a way out for all sides, while simultaneously, in many ways, improving the quality of the unofficial U.S.-Taiwan relationship. Right? So that's a pretty good model of how to manage these issues. And again, that model was applied when then Vice President Lai transited to the United States. It was not by any means the first vice presidential transit. I think it was closer to maybe the high teens or something in terms of history. We looked it up back then. I've forgotten now. But the point is, again, that was another carefully handled encounter where, we were able to make progress, but also avoid upturning precedent. And then, of course, there was the election, which was also carefully handled. The United States was very clear to signal that it didn't back any particular side. It stayed out of the election. And that had a de-escalatory benefit as well. And it brings me to January with President Lai's victory in the election. And after that victory, the PRC response was fairly muted. President-elect Lai at the time gave a fairly, domestically focused and fairly restrained on cross-strait issues victory speech. The PRC didn't see any need to really react. And maybe because of the careful way in which things have been handled over the last year and a half, there wasn't really a significant response. I think that's very important. And one of the lessons to that is that there are ways to handle these tensions, although I worry, as Russell mentioned, that that period may be coming to a close. That's the question before us. Will the period of stability that actually followed August 2022, the period of relative and narrow mutual de-escalation, we shouldn't overstate it. It was fragile, it was limited, it was real. Is that period going to end? And I think now I'd like to turn to sort of the early part. We're only a few months into President Lai's presidency. We have some data that we can look at. We shouldn't be sort of overly ambitious to draw conclusions, but I think there are some interesting data points to look at here. And this is where I'll be much more factual in the remainder of my presentation. We should think about the fact that President Lai's few months in office can be comparable. We should compare them rather with the early months probably of President Chen and President Tsai. And if you remember back then, both President Chen and President Tsai initially in their opening, in their inaugural address, in their opening months, pursued a fairly restrained policy relative to the PRC. I mean, I think President Chen famously in his inaugural address said, we don't pursue independence, we're going to keep some of the unification bodies in place. He put KMT figures into his cabinet. I mean, that was a fairly conciliatory set of steps. We all know how that story turned out. The PRC did not fully reciprocate some of those steps at the time. Okay, maybe they would get it right the next time. We had President Tsai in our office. She also had an inaugural address, which was in many respects fairly restrained. I mean, she acknowledged the 1992 consensus. She actually, I think she called it, Russell, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think she called it, and she said she would, quote, respect the historical fact of the 1992 consensus. And we got a response from the PRC.
That's right. To meetings.
Meetings, that's right. Sorry. She said the meetings before. She didn't use the term consensus. But what I was quoting was the phrase, quote, respects the historical fact, which is, I think, the key phrase. So she acknowledged that it had happened. The key point is that, again, the PRC responded by calling it an incomplete test paper. And of course, she noted, I think, the PRC Constitution and the act governing the relations between Taiwan and the mainland area as relevant in sort of thinking about cross-strait interaction. And so those were all very conciliatory steps. And again, I think after a period of months, you saw the PRC escalate vis-a-vis President Tsai. So I think, President Lai probably came in thinking, and I shouldn't speak for him, of course, my own speculation, but going to past precedent, he probably assumed that fully, sort of restrained speech may not be rewarded either by the PRC. It would not be reciprocated with restraint either. So anyway, he gave his inaugural address. I wrote publicly, along with my colleague at CFR, David Sachs, that we saw a lot more continuity. The difference in that address, although there were important areas of difference relative to President Tsai's 2020 inaugural address, we don't need to dwell on them. The point is the PRC either used that as a pretext or independently was going to respond militarily with a series of exercises around Taiwan. And now that brings us to the question of what are we seeing the PRC do in this new era in Taiwan's politics? How are they handling it? And is the stability that we talked about earlier going to be sustained? Let's look at the military side first. Well, actually, let's back up. Let's first think about the election itself. From a certain point of view, Beijing had reason to be pleased. President Lai got 40% of the vote. He didn't get a majority. Of course, there were three candidates. That could have been seen as reassuring to the PRC. The KMT ended up having the largest share in the LY, leads the LY with Habo Yu. And of course, now the KMT has empowered institutional interlocutors that can meet with the PRC. So the PRC doesn't just have to sort of manufacture them by thinking of people who can go to meet with Wang Huning and others, but might not actually be empowered. Now they have empowered potential interlocutors. So that's a pretty big change. So obviously there you see, that's maybe how they look at the political calculus, and that might presage some degree of restraint, but we haven't really seen too much restraint. I only have 2 minutes left, so I'll be quick. On the military side, you see a number of exercises obviously after the inauguration, May 23rd, 24th. Russell mentioned Joint Sword 2024. He didn't mention it was A, though. So the fact that it was A might mean there'd be a B or C. We saw now perhaps a change in the status quo around Zeeman, which is pretty concerning. The seizure of a fishing vessel, erosion of certain norms about the operation of vessels between Zeeman and the mainland. And that's the military side. So all that's concerning. That's a change in precedent. If stability was based on political restraint being met by military restraint, well, now that bargain, to the extent it ever existed, might be breaking down. That's the military side. Then go to the political side. We see increased disinformation. We see efforts to pressure Taiwan from multiple axes, maybe to exploit cleavages in Taiwan's politics. Obviously, there's been a number of controversies in Taiwan's politics in the last few months with questions about the legislature's role relative to the presidency. protests, which according to the organizers had more than 100,000 protesting what the KMT was attempting to do in the legislature, the largest protest in Sunflower. We see a number of concerns fundamentally about the possibility that the PRC might try to exploit division in Taiwan's politics, which hasn't been seen in a very long time in this institutional way for its own gain. Then you take the economic side, there's clearly been a response here, ending preferential tariffs on 134 import ports. These are tariffs that were guaranteed under ECFA. The question now is whether that economic framework agreement, proper framework agreement from 2010 might be completely nullified by the PRC in the period ahead as a form of putting additional pressure on Taiwan. That is a possibility, hasn't happened yet. It could have happened in June, the PRC said, but again, it hasn't happened yet. It's interesting, they had the product bans under President Tsai. They haven't done that in the same fashion just yet. Remember, they reversed some of those bans in 2022, and then before the election, they reversed them in December of 2023, perhaps for electoral benefit for one particular party. But it remains to be seen what else they might come to do on the economy. Again, we're only a few months in. All of these things are on the table. I think I'll end by simply saying that we should have a bit of modesty about what's coming down the pipe. We just don't know. But what we do know is that historically the PRC has begun in each kind of inaugural period a bit of restraint, and then it kind of elevates and escalates, looking for pretexts to do so across the military, political, and economic domains that I've just covered. And I think in the period ahead, we can expect that as well. And the question for this panel and for many of you is what the correct response is going to be to that. So I'm out of time. There's much more to say, but I will end there. Thank you.
Wonderful, Blush. That's fantastic. I think in your book, The Long Game, you wrote about the sequence to how PRC is pursuing this sequence strategy of displacement. I suspect we're starting to see a similar sort of lining in terms of a sequence strategy with regards to Taiwan, but that's my suspicion with regards to how they're approaching, Taiwan. And now to sort of move on to breaking down to its component parts, this sort of new offensives. We're going to turn over to Alex. Alex, over to you.
Russell, can you guys hear me okay? Well, I appreciate GTI for hosting this, and Russell, as always, for moderating and making these things possible. It's great to be with all of you, and I'm just sorry I couldn't be in person today. I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of before we get into where Taiwan is experiencing PRC aggression in its remaining diplomatic relationships and its international presence. I want to kind of step back for a little minute and talk about this, what I would consider kind of an artificial debate that you hear, and you've seen it in the current administration, you saw it in the administration I served in, about symbolic ways in which we can support Taiwan and more concrete ways in which we can support Taiwan. And you always hear the argument when it comes to Taiwan's diplomatic space from within the U.S. government and from out, that expending too many resources, too much attention on supporting Taiwan's diplomatic space is a symbolic gesture. And I think the implicit part of that statement is that it's a symbolic gesture and therefore it doesn't warrant our attention, and it's a waste of time, and it's not a good use of American bandwidth. I would push back strongly on that, as I have both in government and then in different things I've done through GTI since I left. I think, one, it's a false choice, this discussion between symbolism and substance, for lack of a better word. I don't think very many people here would object to the idea that, what are traditionally defined as more substantive actions that we can take supporting Taiwan, like arms sales or a free trade agreement. Those are all good things. Those are all value added. We should pursue those things. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the things that are too often denigrated as merely symbolic have a substantive value of their own. And that's where I think we get to this question of diplomatic recognition and Taiwan's role on the world stage in its international space. So we have this conversation frequently. We had it in government. We have it on the outside now about, well, we only have about a dozen diplomatic allies left. China has engaged in the systematic campaign to flip Taiwan's allies. They're primarily small, mostly developing countries. Originally, at least a couple of years ago, the majority of the remaining ones were small island states in the Caribbean and the Pacific. And so, how much value, if you're being hard-nosed about it, how much value do does diplomatic recognition from these small developing states really offer to Taiwan? And what's the cost benefit of Taiwan having to expend its, scarce financial and political resources, and the United States doing the same to keep these countries on sides when the PRC is engaging in this incredibly aggressive effort to flip? What's the cost benefit? And are we wasting our time, essentially? And what I would come down on that point is, one of the ways in which we're going to be able to deter and respond to PRC coercion is by having the ability to make the case that Taiwan is a key part of the international system. Obviously, military deterrence is key. Obviously, having the ability to galvanize a coalition of the large states in the region to resist militarily, if necessary, PRC coercion, that's obviously the ultimate key. But part of what I think is the run-up to potential PRC coercion and malign activity is being able to demonstrate that Taiwan has legitimacy on the international stage. And one of the ways in which we're going to be able to do that is by having a coalition of formal diplomatic partners aligned with non-formal diplomatic partners, countries like the United States, who have robust relationships at the informal level with Taiwan, and not letting our eye off the ball in the sense of, you can call it symbolic, but I would say that having those relationships and having those coalitions is going to be absolutely critical to what is certainly not symbolic, which is deterrence. We've seen this now when you look at some of the European countries that have begun to push back on PRC's coercion of Taiwan in Europe. And we've seen, those may not be formal diplomatic allies, but their close informal relationships with Taiwan have been absolutely critical to building the types of ties that have allowed them to push back on PRC malign activity. And so just to talk briefly, in the limited time I have left, just to talk briefly about the role of the United States, I think, in helping to maintain, and I would even go a little bit further, I would argue to expand Taiwan's diplomatic space, both formally and informally and in international organizations. I think on the formal side, we have to be smart with our resources, both Taiwan and the United States. But what I have seen personally is there is a willingness, especially in these small developing states, to hear what the United States has to say when it comes to making a decision about switching recognition to the PRC. Too often, and I think the case of the Solomon Islands is a good example, too often the United States was relatively passive until the last minute. And too often, at least in the Solomons case, we relied heavily on Australia and other regional actors to guide us in what should be our approach to that issue. I think a more forward-leaning stance where we are heavily engaged at a bilateral level with these developing countries, which we should be doing anyway, have already developed ties that allow us to make a compelling case for why Taiwan, as a democratic partner and a like-minded values-based partner, serves these developing countries' interests versus the PRC. I think that's the type of influence that we should be exerting, not waiting until the very last minute where we're scrambling to try and persuade countries that are on the verge of flipping after a very intense Chinese corruption campaign and pressure campaign that they should stay with Taiwan. We should be working this in the off season when we don't have a gun pointed at us. So, I think Solomon's is a great example. We saw similar examples in Central and South America. I think with the United States, and this is something I would give the Biden team great credit for, is building up the U.S. diplomatic presence in places like the Pacific Islands, where hopefully we will be able to have relationships that are built over the long term, where when the U.S. weighs in on the need to maintain those ties between the host country and Taiwan, we already have the diplomatic infrastructure to have those conversations candidly and to be well received, rather than waiting for the last minute. And then finally, I would also say there are opportunities for countries who have long ago switched recognition from Taiwan to China or dissatisfied with the bilateral relationship with the PRC. We have opportunities in a non-heavy-handed way, but in a way in which I think reflects our values, Taiwan's values, and the values of the countries in question to make the case that changing recognition to Taiwan is in everyone's interest. We've seen countries like Micronesia, for instance, that have switched recognition from Taiwan to China and have had a very rough experience of it. And I think that there is every reason for the U.S. government to think proactively, working with Taiwan, about how we can make a compelling case for why resisting, not just resisting China's efforts to switch recognition, but also to be a little more forward-leaning, a little more aggressive about making the contrary case to our partners. And the last thing I would end on, since I'm almost out of time, international organizations. I think, look, we can make the case about symbolism is actually more than just symbolism, and there's actually a value, I think, in having this robust global presence for Taiwan in terms of its ability to forestall PRC coercion. I think international organizations are even more of an easy case to make because these are functional, or whether it's ICAO, whether it's the International Labor Organization, the International Maritime Organization, the World Health Organization, there is a functional argument to be made that the PRC or the Taiwan participating actively in these organizations not just benefits the global order, but it benefits Taiwan and the Taiwanese people directly. And I think it's worth U.S. exertion at the UN and in the UN specialized agency system to push for that type of Taiwanese representation. And I think it's certainly the effort is in proportion to the outcome that we would get from making that type of aggressive push. So Russell, I think I'm out of time. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Alex. I think that's your comments serve as a very important reminder that symbolisms have substantive values too, and I think especially in the context now, wherein the PRC is attempting to legalize its one China principle and then applying that to other international instruments to assert its claims over Taiwan. I think it provides for even more reasons why I think it's important to place more, emphasis on the importance of Taiwan's international space for deterrence, whether that is getting Taiwan into Taiwan's meaningful participation in international organization, but also supporting its relationship and building its relationship with other formal and informal partners as well. And this applies, of course, also to the systematic distortion by the PRC of UN Resolution 275A to assert its claims of sovereignty over Taiwan, wherein anyone who actually reads that document will see clearly and plainly that it makes absolutely no mention of Taiwan. It's non-dispositive of the status of Taiwan, which the PRC claims that it does. And so I think within this broader context, the importance of Taiwan's international space for counter coercion, counter deterrence, or deterrence is I think underappreciated. Thank you. Thanks again, Alex. John, over to you.
Thank you, Russell. And thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. We appreciate you joining us today. For my part of the conversation today, I was asked to discuss a couple things. One was PRC, or perhaps I should say CCP, Chinese Communist Party, political warfare directed against Taiwan, and similarly PRC coercive military pressure directed against Taiwan. Those are two pretty broad topics, and I think to try to make it manageable in terms of time, I decided to kind of fold one into the other to talk a little bit about some patterns that we've seen in recent PRC or PLA, People's Liberation Army, military activity directed against Taiwan and how that fits into a broader context of CCP political warfare. If I could be forgiven a brief shameless plug, this year at GTI, we're doing a series of reports on CCP subversive activities, political warfare activities directed against Taiwan. We released the first of those planned 5 reports in May. It's one I wrote, which is an overview document looking at the various categories of CCP political warfare directed against Taiwan and providing some examples of each. Just to frame that briefly, I'll make a couple points. Again, one is that this military activity that we've seen, what we call gray zone activity around Taiwan's periphery, definitely needs to be understood within that context of political warfare. And the second point to make along with that is that I think it's important. Well, anyone who's known me for a while may have suffered through one of my soapboxes, which is to say that I think if we're looking at trying to understand the actions of the Chinese state, we have to look just a little bit beyond that at the ruling authority of the Chinese state, that being the Chinese Communist Party, and to understand the formative influences on that organization. I've always been very skeptical of the argument that China has this sort of neat strategic culture that goes all the way back to the Sons of Bingfa, the Warring States period, and so forth. I would offer a rejoinder that if you want to understand the worldview and the actions of China's current leaders, don't think of China's current communist leaders, don't think they act the way they do because they're Chinese. Think in terms of them acting the way they do because they're communists. And I think, for example, rather than looking at writings from the Warring States period, you'd be a lot better advised to look at Lenin's writings on United Front work and United Front theory, if you want to understand how the Chinese Communist Party sees the world and how it approaches these issues. And in the writings I've done anyway here at GTI, I've tried to frame it more in those terms and look as my guiding star to George Kennan and what he wrote in the late 1940s at the outset of the Cold War. But anyway, getting to PRC military operations, and again, I would argue that these coercive military activities are seen by the CCP anyway as being very much grounded in intended psychological effects, and that may be something that we don't always pay as much attention to as perhaps we should. The way that the CCP itself frames it, if you look at some of their internal discourse, what we call gray zone operations and stop there, they take it a little bit further, and they tend to refer to these activities as a which is gray zone public opinion struggle. And if you take that term and you think of it in that way, it really does draw out that intended element of the psychological effect of it, of psychological warfare. And Taiwan's own Ministry of Defense, by the way, I think similarly understands and describes it in that way, describing the sort of the dual campaign of subversive activities and military pressure that the CCP undertakes. They describe it as being something like civil attack, military intimidation, this sort of left hand and right hand effort directed at subverting Taiwan society and at targeting sort of the collective psychology of Taiwan citizens. To get to recent trends in PLA military activity directed at Taiwan, sort of more specifically, I would argue, as Rush had pointed out, 2022 is very often pointed to as a watershed, and I think that's correct. It was there was a dramatic change in PRC military activity from the time of those exercises that followed the visit of then Speaker Nancy Pelosi. I would argue, though, that you can see signs of that change coming earlier than that. In the late 2010s, there were some ideological elements in party discourse that we could point to that were signaling a harder line on Taiwan, and particularly in terms of military operations. Again, I would argue there was a pronounced uptick in 2020, particularly in the autumn of 2020, and then continuing on to the present. And that followed a couple of visits to Taiwan by more senior officials of the Trump administration, including the first-time cabinet secretary that visited in a number of years. But that would lead me to a second note of skepticism that I will interject just for a moment. In Beijing's framing of these operations, it always depicts them as but we've tried very hard to be patient. But these Taiwan independence diehards drove us to this, and we had no choice but to send them a message. I would argue instead that I think many of these military operations that Beijing has carried out for coercive pressure have been carefully planned in advance, and the often sort of whatever political event at the moment may have occurred is often a pretext for them to do it. But starting in that period of autumn 2020, there was a significant uptick in what I would call the aviation trinity, which is that there were these sort of unspoken lines that had never formally agreed upon, but which the PRC had observed. One was being circumnavigation of the island. We began to see PLA Air Force aircraft, larger bombers, begin to do that in the 2010s. And then the flights into the Taiwan's declared air defense identification zone, and then the flights going over the center line. And again, the latter of those really, began in the autumn of 2020 going forward. Just to go over for a moment some of the recent military exercises. I don't want to belabor too much what Rush has already discussed. I think I might move forward past the 2022 exercises to the ones we've seen over the last couple of years. The first joint sort of the Lijian exercise that was done in April 2023, and then the joint sort of 2024 exercise that was done in May of this year. For a few trends with that I think are worth pointing out. In June sort of 2023, I think we can see once again a number of military operations that were undertaken to a significant degree for intended psychological effect on Taiwan's populace. One element that was distinctive in Joint Sword 2023 was a series of sort of mass simulated aviation strikes conducted against Taiwan in northern Taiwan, as well as the deployment of the Shandong aircraft carrier and supporting ships to a sea area to the southeast of Taiwan for flight operations there as well. And the narrative framing that came out of Beijing in association with this was very much, this is an encirclement exercise. We're doing a blockade exercise, showing that we can cut off Taiwan from the outside world. That was continued, or some of the same things were continued in Joint Sword 2024, which was conducted in May after this year. And once that's an area again where I would sort of inject that note of skepticism. The PRC tried very much to frame these exercises as, well, we are so outraged by the Taiwan independence content of Lai's speech that we must undertake this exercise to send a message. Again, I would offer a note of skepticism. I think this was all very much planned in advance, and they were going to do this operation no matter what. But that narrative framing is very much a part of the intended psychological effect of these operations. A few things that were noteworthy out of Joint Sword 2024 this year. Once again, we saw these declared exercise boxes around Taiwan. And one thing in particular I think is noteworthy. Again, we've kind of seen a number of these incremental steps where the PRC is attempting to boil the frog and to kind of erode Taiwan's sovereignty just a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. One thing that I think was noteworthy in Joint Sword 2024 was that a couple of their declared exercise boxes, one off of Hualien on Taiwan's east coast, and then one south of Kaohsiung, Taiwan's major port in the south, were both, again, in PRC narrative messaging, were tied to this idea of a blockade. But those declared exercise boxes also crossed over a little bit into Taiwan's contiguous zone. Territorial waters are generally recognized as being 12 nautical miles out from the coast, a contiguous zone being 12 to 24 nautical miles out. Not the same as territorial waters, but it's generally viewed under international maritime practice as a zone in which the state will have some additional authorities for Coast Guard enforcement and so forth. That was the first time we had seen these PRC exercise boxes sort of cross over that line. So another incremental step towards trying to erode Taiwan's sovereignty. I know I'm running short on time. The final note I will offer, the thing that I think is perhaps most significant in recent PRC activity, and one that's worth watching, and that I'm expecting that we're going to see a lot more of, actually goes to some of the, well, what we saw beginning in February around Jinmen, where there was this unfortunate incident where there was an unnamed, unregistered Chinese fishing boat the Taiwan Coast Guard tried to chase it away from waters around Jinmen. The boat capsized, two sailors died. But it began this process by which the PRC was using its Coast Guard specifically to move in and operate more closely around some of Taiwan's outlying islands, particularly Jinmen and Matsu. And I think it's also important to bear in mind that, we would think of the Coast Guard, the U.S. Coast Guard, for example, as being primarily a law enforcement type of organization or straddling law enforcement and the military. In the PRC, the Coast Guard is directly subordinate to the military. In 2018, it was made a part of the People's Armed Police and, of course, the Central Military Commission. It's a military entity and should be properly understood as an adjunct of the Navy. And describing its actions in that period, February, March, when Chinese Coast Guard ships were undertaking very close patrols in and around Jinmen and Matsu. PRC messaging described this as or normalized sort of law enforcement patrol operations. Yet another sign of how they're trying to push in kind of a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, and to regularize these operations as a way of eroding Taiwan's territorial sovereignty. I know I'm running a little bit over on time, so I think I'll pause it there.
Yeah, that kind of great, John. And, I think, again, I think what your comments reflect overall to me is a sort of shift away from the new phase in its approach to Taiwan from one of, not just deterring Taiwan independence, but one of compelling, in its terms, unification Taiwan. And what we're seeing here is this enforcement. It's not so much enforcement of its laws. It's not so much that they're making new laws per se, or issuing legal opinions that applies to laws that they already have, but they're enforcing it now increasingly with its coast guards, with its domestic legal public security instruments, agencies. With the application of this anti-secession law to now potentially, apply the death sentence for so-called, Taiwan separatists and absentia, and without defining, really with the application of the law, so it could actually not only apply to ROC citizens, or BRC, but internationally too as well. So I think this is, these are some, I think, focal trends that speak to this sort of potentially new phase in its approach to Taiwan that I think you were, aptly explaining the latter parts of your presentation. All right, last but not least, Dan, take us on.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here. Thanks for hosting GTI, and all my colleagues' comments were terrific. I really want to emphasize Alex and John in terms of the political warfare sort of element. I mean, the struggle across the Taiwan Strait is fundamentally one of political warfare with military dimensions. So Alex made the point, this sort of foreshadows my suggestions and recommendations about what to do about all this, that the United States has to fight back in the political warfare dimension, not just in the military dimension. So let me just kind of put a few things together here. I mean, my view in general is China's grand strategy when it comes to alliance breaking is comprehensive coercion, and that requires the dominance of the escalatory ladder all the way, so from low intensity to conventional force, increasingly in that A2AD zone. They're also going to dominate in strategic nuclear force, speed of nuclear force as well. That's something that has to be watched more carefully. And it ties directly to Grace activity, because the message sent to target countries is the United States going to risk a conventional war over some of Iraq's chosen territories? B, is it then going to actually risk something more than that if we continue to just continue to harass you? The second point I'd like to underline, and we did so we have this new program at the American Enterprise Institute called the Coalition Defense of Taiwan Project, which has a group of analysts that are
putting out a weekly report that everyone here should get about Chinese activities in the gray zone across Taiwan, Philippines, South China Sea, East China Sea, and so forth. We also put out a report, a short of war coercion campaign report that showed exactly how China could actually take Taiwan, meet its political goals, short of starting a full-scale war. And there, the center of gravity is absolutely politics on Taiwan. And there, there's a lot of talk about how this is not possible, because Taiwan will quote never choose unification voluntarily. Absolutely correct. But imagine a scenario in which the Chinese have a more coordinated coercive campaign over the course of, say, 4 or 5 years that really inflicts all kinds of pain on Taiwan, and the United States doesn't respond because they haven't triggered the threshold of war. There is a possibility, in my assessment, our assessment, that a peace camp emerges in Taiwan. And instead of directly calling for unification, the Chinese kind of call for an interim step, which basically says, hey, let's negotiate a peace deal. As an off-ramp to this intensification of coercion. The United States isn't going to help me anyway, so let's negotiate a peace deal. The peace deal is then a Trojan horse for lost autonomy and sovereignty. Also, I'd like to call your attention to a report we're going to put out in a couple of weeks that shows, John was talking very much about the activities around Jinmen Island and so forth. We're going to show how the Chinese could actually grab, as a coercive measure, not as a prelude to something bigger, grab one of these offshore islands, manufacture a political crisis on Taiwan. And we believe that actually, if you look carefully at what the Chinese are doing around Jinmen, it's not a remote possibility. But again, you have to believe that the center of gravity is the political discourse, and political discussion in Taiwan about the durability of the U.S. commitment and whether the narrative on Taiwan is already changing. And President Lai had to face this in his electoral campaign with charges of not you want independence, but you are going to start a war. He was getting accused in important parts of the Taiwan media, and that was started in Chinese propaganda campaigns. And essentially, if you vote for Lai, you're going to vote for war. And if you vote for war, the United States isn't going to come to your assistance. It's just using you as a pawn to contain us in China. That has appeal in Taiwan, not unification, but that has appeal in Taiwan. If you look at China's strategy as, on the one hand, eroding territorial sovereignty, threatening war, doing these threatening exercises, on the other hand, sending these political narrative messages on Taiwan saying this is going to lead to war, and the United States isn't going to do anything to stop you. All of a sudden, you can see politics on Taiwan changing dramatically. And again, you have to do a number of other things in order to be successful from this perspective. It rendered the Taiwan government ineffective, showed the military as impotent, create panic and fear, but all these things are really within the realm of possibility in terms of Chinese coercive campaigns. The other center of gravity, though, I would argue, is during this period that Rush described, there was a big economist headline, that said Taiwan is the most dangerous place in the world, right? And all of a sudden, CEOs and so forth were calling up people like me and people like Alex, Rush, and so on, and saying, "Guys, there's going to be a war on Taiwan." That's exactly what China is trying to create: a situation in which there's a war fear, a war scare, such that businesses and investments giant on the island of Taiwan. And you really want, we had the situation. So we had the situation that's somewhat akin to the Cold War. So if the United States is successfully deterring a large-scale invasion of Taiwan, the Chinese would say, "Okay, fine, we're deterred, but we're going to do all these other things." And that's what happened in the Cold War with respect to the debates about mutually assured destruction, flexible response. Soviets deterred from a major operation against Germany, but undermining all these states under the threshold of war. And I think that's what we're slowly moving towards, unless the United States comes up with the equivalent of flexible response. I do think in this context, a pure denial strategy, position of denying an invasion becomes not the answer, becomes too passive. And what you actually have to do is impose cost back on China. So the answer to a lot of these challenges is the posing of asymmetric political costs on China, going after the things they actually care about. And Alex pointed to some of those things, which is creating, I think, the idea of creating both a coalition of Taiwan, of those countries that recognize Taiwan and those countries that are favorable to Taiwan is an excellent idea. That's the kind of political cost. That's the kind of thing. All the things that Russia's colleagues are doing with this new lattice work architecture with respect to Asia, the kinds of things that Chinese dislike the most. They're constantly complaining about it. But if you do the sorts of things like build a coalition that Alex is talking about, put Taiwan inside a regional air defense architecture. So instead of tiring the Taiwan Air Force out by trying to track every Chinese fighter jet that's coming across ATIS and so forth, you actually say, no, that's not our answer. In fact, we're going to track some of these things. Taiwan's going to be part of a regional air defense architecture. That's how you get Chinese attention. That's how you get the Chinese to back off from these types of activities. Same thing with, and again, this presupposes a much bigger U.S. capacity to do these things. We're really suffering from the lack of capacity, but same thing with law enforcement patrols in some of these places, getting fishermen to the fisheries where they're allowed to be, getting people who are allowed to explore for oil in places that they're allowed to be. Again, presupposes a lot more Coast Guard cooperation, presupposes a lot more Coast Guard capacity in the United States as well. So asymmetric political costs is the answer, but you also have to be able, I think, in this kind of, and again, with respect to civil aviation, it just seems like such a no-brainer to be for the United States to be much more active in getting Taiwan not just involved in ICAO, but in even kind of having civilian aircraft from various regional countries actually fly, maybe escort, maybe not, got through a little bit through some of these lines that John mentioned where the Chinese are erasing. But essentially, you say to the Chinese, you do whatever you want militarily, we're just not accepting those as facts. We've missed that opportunity in the South China Sea. Some of us were arguing for that same kind of strategy, which is asymmetric political costs, which was, just, convoying and making it clear to Chinese we just frankly didn't accept what they were claiming in legal domain, political domain. We can't lose that opportunity in the Taiwan Strait because they're essentially running a very similar playbook right now in the Taiwan Strait as they were running in South China Sea. Now, of course, this is a strategy that there are many more implicit risks in this strategy, this new cost imposition, but I think a lot less risk than actually getting into a war with China, showing them the gray zone that you're willing to actually impose costs on them, I think adds to your deterrent of an actual conflict. So my time is running short. There's a lot more to say of what we can do in the legal space. We'll have to do in the legal space as well, but I'll let you do that in Q&A. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot, Dan. I mean, you had a lot of good insights in there. One of the things that just struck me when you're talking about the propaganda narratives that the PRC is directing against Taiwan as one that is effective is that Taiwan doesn't want to be a pawn of the United States and that it will draw into war. And that and it struck me that this is a narrative that applies not only to Taiwan but also to other regional allies of the United States like South Korea, like in other areas of Japan, when particularly as applies to Okinawa and places like that. And so some of these sort of tactics and techniques that we see the PRC apply to Taiwan is certainly using in other places as well. And I think it's instructive. I think it's just as a thorough case study to better understand these sort of political warfare methods that it applies to Taiwan because it's broadly applicable to it as well. It's not sort of sui generis sort of case as sometimes is often made. I think especially in the area of political warfare, it's Taiwan offers a playbook of what the CCP is utilizing in other places as well, and as well looking at Taiwan as an important case study of how to respond also to these measures is also look at. Not a lot of good points to drop on that. We can certainly pick up here in our moderated discussion. So just as a reminder to our audience members, both here in person as well as online, that we will reserve around 15 minutes at the end of today's discussion, starting round 4 for audience Q&A. So, start thinking about what you want to ask our really superb set of panelists. And again, reminder for our online audience members that you may submit your questions via email to contact@globaltaiwan.org, or utilize the YouTube function on the next to the video screen, as well as tweet us at Global Taiwan. So I want to start with a question for the group, because our focus today, has been entirely really on the counter coercion, arena. But of course, there's another flip side to this, the threat that PRC poses to Taiwan. And U.S. intelligence has shown that China's President Xi Jinping has instructed his country military to be ready by 2027 to take Taiwan if called upon. The former Office of Naval Intelligence Commander, Rear Admiral Mike Studeman, also has written fairly recently that, and I quote, "Developments underway suggest Taiwan will face an existential crisis in single-digit years, most likely in the back half of the 2020s or front half of the 2030s." End quote. Why do you think war is a less or more likely option for Xi in the near term to mid? Anyone would like to take that question?
I can start.
Yeah.
So for Xi to decide on a full-scale war, which is obviously a possibility we have to take seriously, very seriously. But I think what's missing sometimes from the analysis is, so to conduct that level of amphibious invasion, to conduct that extremely complex military operation, if you just go through, as the Chinese do, and look through the history of those types of operations, you realize there's a lot of preparatory work that has to be done before you actually put 1,000 troops on an island. And a lot of that preparatory work has to do with the level of air supremacy and maritime supremacy we need, and so forth. So for China to actually prepare the battlefield, so to speak, to conduct that type of operation, Xi Jinping's going to have to make a really serious, not operational consideration, but geopolitical consideration, which is, do I or do I not attack U.S. forces or not Japanese forces on Japan, and when do I do that? And Guam as well. And again, amphibious warfare doctrine, the way we do it, and we haven't found much doctrine on the Chinese side, but would say, look, you would be crazy not, to leave in place U.S. Air Force operationally so close to Taiwan Strait. So it's a geopolitical consideration. It's a serious one. If the answer to that question is yes, I do have to attack Japan and Guam in order to successfully put all these troops on Taiwan, he automatically starts World War III. So on the Taiwan question, he's attacked an ally. The United States has attacked his territory. That's much further than Putin has gone in his very aggressive action here. Now he can have a different calculus, roll the dice and say, not necessary. The U.S. isn't going to do anything anyway. They'll just watch as I invade. They'll just watch from Okinawa and so forth. But a very risky operational choice if he decides not to, or the third option in that sort of political decision-making construct he would have is, well, I have such excellent A2 AD capabilities that if the United States does decide to intervene, I will defeat those forces at a time. But again, in order to actually successfully conduct the amphibious operations, you'd have to actually go through this calculus of whether or not you're going to attack a U.S. ally preemptively at some point in the war, and then there's no question that this is no longer the time. But so I think that calculus. Now again, this calculus can change over time. Capabilities can get even greater. Our capabilities can continue to grow. But that's a serious political decision Xi Jinping would have to make in order for his operations to succeed. And that's why I think At this point, he still prefers the kind of gray zone.
I think what I'm also hearing from you is that it's not confidence, right? It doesn't have the confidence right now to really do that. And it's a psychological matter, it's a political matter. And so the terms in some ways, I like to describe that such as more of an art than a science in some ways, and it's about deterring that one man, especially now in Zhongnan, right? Which is,
well, again, I think that to the extent he thinks it's a larger war,
yeah,
and that can't just be localized to Taiwan.
right.
I think deterrence is strength.
Right, which is what I think Bush and his team and the Biden administration has done with this lattice work of, partnerships and formal and informal partnerships, sort of raises that sort of prospect, or uncertainty, at least in the minds of Xi Jinping, that, I think applies towards the, this type of broader terms that I think we are thinking about. Anybody would like to sort of address this question, or if not, then I can move on to more directed questions for each of you before we open off the audience in Q&A. Alex, did you want to say something? I just saw you unmute.
Yeah, I'll say one quick thing. And obviously, you don't pretend to be a China expert like Dan and some others on the panel, but I'll just a couple thoughts on where we are with why people like Mike Studeman and others are, I think, predicting that this is a single digit year, whether it's an invasion or something lower on the spectrum of coercion. But I think there's an argument to be made that we're in this window of danger primarily for domestic reasons in the PRC, as they're looking for, what is the CCP's source of legitimacy as the economy ceases to grow at the rates that they promised their populace for years, without any concomitant growth in personal and political freedom. I think you can make an argument that, I find persuasive, that the only way, if the economy continues to stagnate, the only way you're going to continue to be able to make it the case for the CCP's legitimacy is having a overseas adventure of some kind that brings the century of humiliation to a close. And so I think that, coupled with I think a incorrect but a perception that the United States is in a internal situation that would make our response difficult, coupled with that, I think we are in a window of danger, not necessarily for an invasion, but maybe for a blockade, maybe for something that targets the outlying islands. I do think that for the factors I named, we are in this moment of danger for the foreseeable couple of years.
Yeah, just a few quick thoughts on this. I'm not sure any of these will be that surprising. On the question of whether or not there's sort of a diversionary war possibility, I'm a little bit skeptical only because I think that the PRC repressive apparatus is probably sufficient, that there's not a need, and there might be in weaker authoritarian regimes, to direct everything to an external other through a military contest. So I think Xi Jinping probably does not feel he's losing grip on power. If that's the case, then there's probably less reason for diversion. That being said, it's also interesting, we haven't talked a lot about how the PRC has tried to manage opinion on the Taiwan issue in the PRC. That's a really interesting indicator. Many people in this room who look at Chinese media could probably help bolster that analytical effort. I mean, if you see the PRC censoring nationalist voices or encouraging more hostile approaches on Taiwan, that's a very interesting data, right? Don't you think? It suggests that maybe there's a desire to modulate some of the nationalism to have more freedom of maneuver. I think if you look at the open source evidence, there's some indication that's occurred sometimes, which implies some degree of nuance in the PRC position, including about the timing of when they want things to get more serious. I think I'd end by saying the thing that I'm most concerned about when it comes to near term, with respect to the possibility of PRC escalation, is really the signals that the U.S. and its allies and partners may set. And we've all talked about some of the great work that began in prior administrations, continued in this administration on allies and partners. I think that's a shared effort across multiple U.S. administrations that's bearing fruit. Now, I think there were some challenges to that approach previously, but I think in the last few years, a lot of progress was made. So that's a very good thing. Put that aside for just a moment. There's two other things that we should keep in mind. One is the risk that, U.S. leaders or members of Congress or others might send signals that suggest we're not resolute. I worry a little bit about that possibility. And I think that, there are some reasons to think more about that possibility influencing Chinese decision making. I think we have an analog for a case where that might have occurred a little bit, is Hong Kong, where perhaps you could argue that some of the signals that were sent from the United States about Hong Kong are probably more mixed than they should have been back in that period. So we can think about that as a cautionary tale. There's no guarantee that a more resolute signal would have changed the situation in Hong Kong and changed and encouraged the PRC return, but there's that possibility. And there's a second kind of side of this. If one risk is being too irresolute, the other risk might be being too confrontational or being too focused on certain kinds of measures that lead the PRC to think that our aims are not cross-strait peace and stability, which is what every administration has always said, but rather far more maximalist than that. Perhaps even a formal policy, we wouldn't call it formal, they might think this is a policy that goes beyond that and seeks some kind of permanent political separation as a matter of US policy. That's not what anybody is advocating for, but you don't want them to get that in their heads because then they have less reason for restraint in the near term. So the main risks that I see in the immediate term are, again, getting the signaling wrong, either in the direction of being too irresolute or being in the direction of too confrontational on certain key sensitive matters. And that allows there to be challenge here with that direction.
Excellent. Can I just say one thing? Yeah, sure. Very much talking. No, please go ahead. I take the point that Rush is making about, about the dangers and risks of looking to the PRC, that we're looking for some sort of permanent separation. But what I would not recommend is taking that off the table publicly, because that is for the United States to have its own political escalatory ladder. Kind of needs to believe that if it does certain things, the U.S. will escalate to the ultimate level politically with respect to the future of Taiwan. It needs to believe that if it actually attacks Taiwan, there's a possibility that the United States will actually change its policy towards Taiwan. So while I take the point in terms of a declaratory policy, and I take the point in terms of a stated policy or even a deliberate policy, I'm just very, very skeptical about the utility of reassuring China about just about anything, because that removes from us the important statecraft.
Yeah, I mean, I think it all comes down to what you think the PRC's perceptions are and how that drives decision making. Without getting into a back and forth debate on that, which I don't think is necessarily worthwhile. I'll just simply say the bigger risk, I think, in my mind, is not that, because the U.S. policy is what it is. There's no reason to necessarily change it one way or the other. So let's put that to the side of the question of, ideal political settlements. I think the question that's most concerning is whether or not the U.S. sends signals that it's not resolute on Taiwan. And that is the kind of language recently that many have seen. And that is the most concerning. The idea that the U.S. would suggest it's no longer in a position of strategic ambiguity, but actually walking not towards clarity in the direction of defense, but clarity in the direction of non-defense is the biggest concern that I see. And I think it's a concern many in Taiwan have. And that, and the Hong Kong analogy from 2019, I think that combined is actually the biggest risk, not the other side of the equation.
All right. Returning to the topic of countering the PRC's coercion campaign, I'm going to stick with you, Rush, here, because you wrote in the Foreign Affairs in 2020, and I know people don't like, sort of calling back all the things they've written in the past. I've certainly, written a fair share of things that, would have liked to. But, you wrote this on the eve of Taiwan's presidential election in 2020, and then you wrote, and I quote here, China's strategy in Taiwan. This is in reference to the influence operation, information campaigns, may not bear fruit this weekend, but it may well prove successful down the line. And so now after the 2024 elections in Taiwan, the new political dynamics that we see in Taiwan now, with the Biden government, president with a weaker mandate in terms of, popular votes, just, 3 consecutive terms of a DPP president with a DPP president. Do you think that this Chinese strategy that you were writing about has a higher or lower likelihood of success?
Yeah, well, thanks for calling back that piece. And I do, in fact, agree with myself, which is not always the case. But what I would say is that on the question of, their political strategy, I agree with Dan and Alex and others and John about political warfare really being central here. And I think that I think about that more in terms of Taiwan's domestic politics being a risk. I think that's particularly interesting. In 2020, there was a lot of uncertainty, I should say, about what the impact of these efforts would be. And I think you remember that, Russell, and a lot of people here remember there were questions with some of the efforts that were underway, PRC was taking online and other platforms, online and online, in other platforms.
Sorry, yes,
So not just would they bear fruit? And in the end, it did. And so what we also saw, and what the U.S. tried to learn from, I think, Taiwan on, was this kind of complex ecosystem to push back on disinformation, which over time became more and more successful. Now, you can't always bat 1,000 with that kind of ecosystem. Sometimes, things aren't going to work out. There's plenty of efforts currently underway, disinformation about, for example, AIT, Taipei's office space, or about the U.S. commitment, or about the statements certain politicians. All that's out there. And again, there were attempts to kind of inject it into the recent election. And we didn't see it completely bear fruit. So I'm not sure what to make of the disinformation play. I think that's still alive, and I think we should still be concerned about that. I think you're right, Russell, that they refine that play in Taiwan in many ways, running other countries. But what I'm more interested in and concerned by this time around is divided government always creates opportunities in any political system. This is not a Taiwan unique challenge. It's in any country that has divided government. There are cleavage points, and there's tensions, and there's challenges in coordination. And democracies, to be able to implement grand strategies, to be able to be resilient, have to have good coordination across all the agents of the state, all the branches of government. That's a harder thing to do when government's divided. So what I worry about is more that there will be certain action that needs to happen for Taiwan's security in the period ahead, whether that's investments in defense and resilience, including both cyber resilience, which is a priority of President Lai, that it'll be harder to undertake in a divided government for the reasons that I referenced in that article. To me, that is the biggest risk, because time in many ways is the scarcest commodity, that in addition to resource, of course. But time is one of the scarcest commodities that we have, and I worry that there may be ways in which that time is not spent as well as it should be. I think I'll end by saying that to the degree both sides, China and also, Taipei and Washington, all sides are trying to buy time. The strategic question becomes who uses that time better. And so what I worry is about the possibility that political influence interference efforts ensure that Taipei, but also the West, don't use the time as well as they should.
I have plenty of other questions for our experts here today, but I want to get you guys engaged in the conversation as well. So I'm going to open up the Q&A. Please raise your hand. Wait for giving mics. Okay, we want mics. And then state your name as well as affiliation, and then direct your question to one or more speakers. Okay.
I'm Peter Humphrey. I'm an intelligence analyst and a diplomat. I should point out that if you're going to put up a blockade, you got to be willing to sink ship. So if you get some Vietnamese freighter coming to Kaohsiung and the captain says, "Screw you," the Coast Guard or the Navy, they have to sink that ship. They pay an extreme price for our blockades. My big concern is that I see 50 to 100 people in this city pondering what invasion date might be. And they're all coming up with various anniversaries or dates or probabilities of who's ready to win, and all that kind of stuff. If I was a PRC invader, I would not invade any of the small islands. I would not blockade. I would not cancel leave. I would do none of those things and then launch a completely warningless invasion, because that's the only strategy that can really win. How do I get some of the analysts here overseas in the Pentagon to think about the no warning invasion possibility?
Perhaps let's take a couple of questions, and then we'll allow the group to address those piece by piece. Okay. Keep hands up. This lady in the back, please. Take 3 questions, and then we'll go to the experts, and then we'll return back to the audience.
I'm Abby Fu, previously research fellow at Hudson Institute and currently a senior analyst at a development company. And my question more directly to Alex, but also open to the panel as well, is we hear frequently a lot about U.S.-Taiwan cooperation in terms of defense and diplomacy, but we rarely hear about possibilities in U.S.-Taiwan cooperation directly in terms of development. I'm curious as to your thoughts on, considering PRI and, the U.S. also being limited and Taiwan being limited in terms of countering China dollar to dollar. Like, what are some concrete opportunities of cooperation, whether that's directly related to USAID and the development arm on Taiwan? So, thank you.
Over here. Yeah, okay.
Hi, Mike McDevitt. I'm a senior fellow at CNA. It's kind of a Cap Smith crapshoot to decide what year China is going to launch the invasion. What year is the most dangerous window we need to be careful about. As an old Cold Warrior, I would make the observation that as long as we have escalation dominance, the United States probably doesn't need to worry about bolt out of the blue invasion from the mainland against China. But as they continue to build their nuclear weapon stockpile, once they get to equivalence, and I think that they're aiming toward equivalence. After all, when Xi Jinping said he wants a world-class military, he didn't say, I want a world-class military except for nuclear weapons. That's when we have to worry about China throwing its weight around with regard to Taiwan in terms of actual coercive activity, because then we heard President Biden already worried about dealing with the Russians in Ukraine because of anything, but what else? Because of a nuclear equivalence with the Russians. And so I think that's the thing, that's the ball to keep your eye on in terms of when things are really liable to be very, very dangerous with regard to Chinese intent.
All right, thank you very much for that. All right, so we have 2 questions and a comment that will allow our panelists to address as they choose, or if it's directed to you, then please address that. But we have the question about the bolt from the blue scenario, the likelihood of that, as well as, which I don't think David already responded to also as well, and also U.S.-Taiwan cooperation in development in the development space. So. Alex, you want to maybe take that development question, because since that was directed at you, and then we can turn it to the other panels.
Sure. It's a great question, and it gets to a systemic problem that the U.S. and our allies have that, I noticed when I was working on Pacific Islands issues specifically, which is the type of projects that we do traditionally are not the type of projects that the small developing states, primarily, small island states, want. Now, not that the projects that we do aren't valuable. They're more focused on developing technical capacity and capacity building. But what you often see is what these developing island states want is large-scale infrastructure projects. And that's where Belt and Road has been so successful. Taiwan and frankly the United States do not have the individual or collective capacity to, at least as currently budgeted, to compete at that scale, even in the small island states. And even though the Build Act allowed us to revamp some of our development institutions, and DFC is coming along, we still, for a variety of institutional and bureaucratic reasons, and frankly, I think political will, allocate the type of capital that's needed in small developing states. We're certainly in Washington not set up to be competitive in those places, and Taiwan's not either. I think the only solution here is having consortiums of the US, Taiwan, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, having like-minded countries working together in this space. Obviously, the challenge that we would run into frequently is some of those countries are reluctant to work openly with Taiwan in this space. And, that certainly creates a challenge if the goal is to enhance Taiwan's ability to project its influence and to project its value add as a partner. If the consortium we're talking about doesn't want to include it or make it a silent partner rather than an open partner, that doesn't get us very far. So, look, I think the role of the United States here can be as organizing capital, working with local partners to figure out what are the projects that are most value added for them, and the projects that, frankly, we would have the most concern if China took on rather than us. And to advocate, as I think both administrations, the previous one and the current one, have done at various points, to advocate with our partners that Taiwan should have a robust role in these types of projects, and that there is a imperative here for Taipei to be represented in the development space in an open way, because it serves all of our interests. So I think there's very much an American role here to compensate for some of the collective shortcomings that we in the alliance system have in the development space.
Any takers for the other questions?
I guess I could make just a couple comments about preparations for a both of the blue blockade. I'd be very cautious in commenting on what persons inside of U.S. government agencies would be planning for in terms of scenarios. I mean, I would expect that there are people working at PACOM and on the joint staff who have.
That's what they get paid for.
For a broad variety of scenarios. I actually might offer a thought from the other side of that fence, in that if there were, again, this theoretical situation, to be a sort of a short notice sudden imposition of a blockade or a declared PRC blockade on Taiwan, I think they would have a number of really serious difficulties with trying to enforce that. For some of the exercises that we've discussed today, those have not, well, there's a couple of things I would identify as having been missing from those, again, in the larger sense. One is coordination with amphibious landing activities. We haven't really seen that. It's been mostly air and naval and missile activity anyway in 2022. But there hasn't, we haven't really seen a lot of activity in terms of training in 2022 and the exercises that followed then Speaker Pelosi's visit. I think there was some PRC messaging about sort of declaring searches of vessels going into Taiwan. I don't recall them actually doing anything to try to enforce that. So I think the U.S. Navy, for example, has a lot of institutional experience in doing maritime eviction operations. In connection with Iraqi-produced oil, for example, before the invasion in 2003, and with sanctions enforcement related to Iran and North Korea and so forth. That same sort of institutional knowledge or experience isn't there on the side of the PLA Navy. And I think there would be a lot they would have to do, both in terms of crew proficiency training and laying out clear rules of engagement and so forth, if there were to be any sort of blockade or even a soft blockade of stopping and searching ships. And again, at least in my own awareness, I don't see them having done a lot of training in that way. So I think there'd be a certain level of necessary ramp up on that side as well, if the PRC were to contemplate such a thing.
I think we have time to take one more wave of questions and pull out the close out. Like this lady, please keep your hand raised so that way.
Thank you. My name is Harmony, and I'm a Taiwanese student currently studying at Vanderbilt University. My question is pertains to the upcoming U.S. election, and recognizing how Alex and Rush both mentioned there has been some symbols sent out by the U.S. with regards to kind of going on the non-defense side. How do you think given the tensions with the upcoming election, how would China potentially react? Could they take some action, and what can we anticipate to occur either during that time or after that time?
Gentlemen, right next.
Thank you. My name is Tony. I'm a recent Johns Hopkins Science grad. I guess my question is that it seems that John and Dan both mentioned for the coercive campaign to work, there's two elements. There's the military element, and there's also the cognitive and information segment. And I think with the military element, it seems like that they are slowly encroaching on Taiwanese sovereignty. But with the cognitive and information side, it seems like the effect is not as obvious because Taiwan is fighting back in different ways. So let's say that the military, the information and cognitive aspect does not work out, but the military aspect works out very well. What are China's next steps to further escalate the situation? Would you say it's a blockade, taking some of the islands, direct invasion, or some other option?
Okay, and then I'm going to take one question from the online, and then this is just from Hiroki Nakanishi, a member of the LVP. And let me just paraphrase this question that he wants to know, are there ways in which we can influence China to stop its military adventurism? And we talked a lot of the ways about how the PRC is influencing us, but is there ways in which we could, allies, partners, influence China's military adventurism? And so open it to the panelists, pick and choose whichever one you want to address, and try to keep it very brief since we are already at time right now. Okay, thank you.
I'll just go first, if I may. So I agree with first, like with Devin's comments about the problems with I think we're moving to if you look very carefully at the constitution of Chinese forces, it's also theater nuclear forces, which is meant to also stay in Japan, stay on whatever conflict we're going to hook up, because basically the United States is going to defend you if they're not hit. And I think we're moving to an entirely different construct here in terms of,
Unless I keep putting water in the missiles instead of gas.
yeah, exactly, that too. But I think you're absolutely right about one of the chief lessons the Chinese have learned from Putin is Washington changes its political calculations with respect to aiding other countries if you threaten, if you credibly threaten. That has happened. Yeah, so I paid great attention to the changes in the Constitution of changing forces. So really quickly on the other question. So I don't think coercive campaigns work without the cognitive element working. I think annihilative campaigns. So I think the answer to your question is, if you're not changing politics on Taiwan, you're not changing political opinion on Taiwan about the utility of resistance, then you have to escalate into an invasion. But I think the main point here is that it's not a bolt out of the blue invasion. The Chinese are already engaging in a coercive campaign. It would be an escalation from a coercive campaign to an annihilation. And if you take away anything from the my comments today, is that these activities are underway already. If they work, the Chinese continue. If they don't work, the Chinese have to think about escalating to whatever these.
Any takers for the other questions? Okay. Yeah.
Sure, yeah, and very quickly, since we're over time, just on all the questions really fast. On the question of both from the blue, it's important, I think it's been addressed. I just want to put a marker down that there's been interesting debate in the US and in Taipei about the question of protracted conflict and China's preparations for that. That's an area that deserves, I think, more study by many in this room, and that's something we should think more about. On the question of development cooperation, there is an MOU between USAID and Taiwan. That's important insofar as it goes, but to Alex's point, there's infrastructure that needs to be considered as well. So we have to go beyond that to be able to really make a splash in, say, the Pacific Islands. On the nuclear question, I think Admiral Devin's point is exactly right. I have nothing that I would say other than to agree with it. I would go maybe a little further. I worry about the PRC acquiring a different set of capabilities that are more unique and exquisite. Look at the fractional orbital bombardment test that was referred to happened some time ago. That's a unique bespoke capability that gets you away from just the question of mutually assured destruction to the question potentially of, talents to some degree as well. Maybe that's a bit too extreme. I think a lot of people quibble with that. But in any case, it's worth thinking about what the implications are if they have unique capabilities that can't easily be matched. The missile defense can't easily be. On the question of the U.S. election, and I've already said I share your concern about this. I think I wouldn't worry as much about anything happening after the election. I think the question is really about signals sent during the election and after the election. If certain signals suggest, again, that the U.S. is irresolute, again, I worry that that creates an opening. I mean, I do think that the deterrence balance is a matter of, yes, deterrence, but also a bit of reassurance. I'm worried that the deterrence quotient is actually what could weaken in the period ahead. That's what I'm most concerned about, I think, in some of these comments. On the military and cognitive question, I couldn't agree more with what Dan said. But finally, on the question of ways to influence the PRC to stop its military ventures, I just refer you back to what everybody on this panel has said. There's a lot the U.S. and its allies and partners can do in the region to create costs by being more interoperable, diversifying policy. Look at the U.S. today, AUKUS, more of the Southwest Islands, Japan doubling its defense budget, Tomahawks, the Philippine EDCA sites, PNG. I mean, that's a pretty significant structural change. You could do 4 more years of that. That changes the facts on the grounds a bit. You added that changes in U.S. force design. You're really getting somewhere. So those are the kind of steps I want to see on the security side. With allies and partners, you want to always make the PRC seem like the provocateur, I think, not the United States. There are ways to do that. That worked out for 2022. International business got concerned about China. Those are the kinds of things we should make sure we tighten up on with respect to messaging. And that goes to Dan's point about political warfare. That is a form of political response. You saw the Biden team try to do that. I think that's going to be relevant no matter who's in the White House in the next administration.
Very good. Any more from John or Alex? If not, then we'll close out.
I just want to say one thing on the U.S. election, Russell. I disagree with Rush a little bit on that. What I worry about is a Chinese misunderstanding of where we are in our domestic politics. This is a similar concern I think people have had about misunderstanding the military balance more generally and making decisions based on, I think, misunderstanding of U.S. capabilities. I think there's a similar concern in my mind that perceptions they may have about societal incohesion and issues that we have domestically, issues with our ability of our leadership of both parties to make decisions in effective ways. I worry that they may be overstating those strengths and deluding themselves into thinking they have a window of opportunity that they really don't have. And so I do worry a little bit about misperceptions of American weakness that ultimately could lead to decisions that would be very, very bad for everybody.
Okay. Well, thank you for that last. Well, Alex gets the last word, but apologize for running over time. But I think you all agree that this has been a very fruitful exchange. Please join me in thanking our Take care.
Thanks, guys.
Good seeing you, Dan.